So really delighted to be introducing and welcoming our speakers tonight. It was a big treat for me to be able to facilitate and welcome you to this. We have two fantastic speakers tonight, and I would really like to introduce my two colleagues. Rabbi Judith Rosen-Berry studied at Leobeck College, ordained by Rabbi Sheila Schulman, became congregational rabbi of BKY when Sheila retired, and now teaches Jewish theology at Leobeck College and Oxford, where she's also on the team of Oxford Three Faiths Forum and has been living in the Isle of Skye. There is more, but I don't want to take up more of their time. And Rabbi Michael Shire, who was a great teacher of mine as I trained at Leobeck College. Michael is now High Holy Day Rabbi at Oxford Liberal Community, professor at Hebrew College Boston, and has just started, and lucky them, as part-time rabbi for Central Reform Temple in Boston. So Michael brings that American perspective with. We welcome you both tonight, and to all of you who are here to listen, and really looking forward to this evening and where you will take us on the notion of Jewish theology.
Wow. Okay. Sorry, I'm just flicking my camera so I can see a few more people. And of course, the first thing that I'd like to do this evening is to thank you all very much for joining LJ at 120 and Michael and I in our it's a sort of conversation, even though we'll kind of split our session into two, but there has been a conversation ongoing between Michael and myself for a while about the subject of really ethical monotheism and how we understand contemporary Jewish ethics in our communities today. So thank you all for joining us. And what I want to do just very, very quickly is to describe, in a sense, something that what you can expect over the next hour. So what Michael and I are asking you and ourselves are some of the following questions. How do liberal Jews lead good lives today? From where do we derive our ethical values and our moral compass? And can or should we continue to say that our moral lives and our ethical values are derived from God? So to kind of enable this discussion, we're going to construct a debate, I hope Michael thinks this is right, around ethical values, which is what I'm going to be talking about, and in a sense, Jewish virtues, which is what Michael is going to be talking about. And how they play out in progressive Judaism at the moment, and also how, not just that, but how we can progress those ideas into the future. So I'm going to do that by presenting two very short sessions between Michael and ourselves, and then a small group discussion after Michael has spoken. And then we'll try and come back together again to share some reflections and some thinking. And then if there's time, Michael and I will maybe just kind of round up the evening. But we'll kind of see how the time flows. So the first presentation is mine, and I'll be focusing on the liberal Jewish ethical values that we describe as, and this is kind of important here, that we describe as objective, unalterable, and universal, whose source is commonly believed to be God, as reflected in our theology of ethical monotheism. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might need to rethink all of that in 10 minutes. And then Michael's going to take on the second presentation, and he's going to be looking at the development of the virtue ethic of caring, or chesed, and its connection to the Mussar tradition, and how that might be understood through the prism of liberal Jewish ethical monotheism. Then, as I say, there'll be an opportunity, hopefully, for a 10 or 15 minute small group discussion, in which we'll be looking at a very simple question, which is whether giving tzedakah is a value-based command or a virtue-based choice? Is it, in other words, an objective and therefore universal value that is a rule, or a subjective, personally cultivated virtue? So if you pass a homeless person, for example, on the street, do you give tzedakah without thinking because it's just the thing that we do? It's part of how we understand behaving justly as a progressive Jew. Or do we give tzedakah because we've cultivated the virtue of compassion or caring? So the big question really is, I know it's a little bit of a binary and there's going to be a lot of nuance, hopefully, kind of like brought into this discussion. But the big point that we're trying to get at is whether our teachings around tzedakah are best served by command, the command to do so, to give, or by the cultivation of personal choice. So that's going to be the kind of the fundamental question. So we chose this kind of fairly simple scenario because it's obviously one that all of us have wrestled with many times, especially as we've seen the crisis of homelessness kind of growing in the UK. The prevalence of people having to sleep out on the street is something that we can't ignore. So it's become very familiar to us, which means I think that you'll be bringing sort of your own expertise and your own nuance to respond to the big question that Michael and I are asking. Now, I'm going to begin now with the first part of this evening session. And I always think it's good, and it's part of the tradition, obviously, to begin any kind of teaching, any sharing with a question. And the question that I would be asking, if I were you, might be, why are we even addressing the issue of objective ethical values? Values kind of like encapsulated in the 10 commandments, like do not murder, do not lie, do not covet, do not treat the stranger unjustly, etc. We know them. We know them really, really well. So why spend this time thinking about them? And I would agree with the question, but I would also say that ethics is absolutely central to who we are as liberal Jews. So we can't allow things to stagnate. We can't allow our thinking or our behavior to kind of like just stop, thinking that we know how we should be responding. So I would answer the question, my own question, I think that you would be asking, in two parts. Firstly, I think that our theology of ethical monotheism, which explains the origin of our objective ethical values, needs some rethinking. And secondly, because the very notion of objective ethical values in our society today, and therefore in our own communities, is disappearing. And I would like us and liberal Judaism to think about the consequences of this. So we've arrived at a historical moment where the big story that Judaism used to tell about ethical monotheism, namely that the one God is the source of our ethical values, which are as a consequence objective and therefore universal, is no longer credible to many liberal Jews. So the question for me then is, as an LJ rabbi, how much further can we, or should we, in our communities try to progress with a theology of ethical monotheism if it's not considered a coherent or acceptable theology for most of us? It's a complicated picture, but one that we need to discuss. Otherwise, the theological and intellectual insights and values that progressive Jews have held for generations will be lost. And it's now, perhaps more than ever, that we need to contribute to the societal discussion around what a 21st century ethics should look like. So in brief, I'm for a rethinking of ethical monotheism for both its theological content, what it tells us about God, and for its humanistic content, for what it tells us about ourselves, about humanity. But 15 minutes is obviously not enough time to even scratch the surface of this subject. So we need to find time in the future to discuss it. And I know I keep saying it, and we do keep kind of like having stabs at it, which is really, really good. But it's a really, really important question for liberal Judaism. And what I want to try and avoid is, I'm not saying this will be what will happen, but what I want to try and avoid is perhaps the kind of an unconscious drift away from ethical monotheism and all that it means to us, so that we end up in a place not knowing how or why we arrived there. That's my only agenda. I don't mind conscious drift, but I'm slightly wary of unconscious drift. So that's what I'm trying to kind of encourage. Now, given that we can't really do very much of what I've already described tonight, what I do really, really want to do, and very quickly, is to invite you to think about the value of how we reconfigure our relationship to objective ethical values. How we, the objective ethical values that we particularly find within progressive ethical monotheism. Now, what I'm suggesting is a little bit tricky and a little bit controversial. So I know it sounds like I've started, but I'm actually only just beginning. That was just the introduction. Well, the second introduction. But here we go. So the objective ethical values that liberal Jews have taught are not only integral to ethical monotheism, but explained by ethical monotheism. Ethical monotheism was a theological revolution that argued that God was the best explanation for the existence of objective universal ethics and a model for human moral behavior. It taught values like truthfulness, justice, and compassion as essential, non-arbitrary, and universal. So the Jewish story then tells how we were instructed by God to follow a set of ethical rules of God's devising, which were then interpreted and expanded by the rabbis into a system of halakha, which are the 613 mitzvot, that were to be followed and obeyed in our daily lives. And then progressive Jews arrived on the scene and removed halachic observation and obligation from liberal Jewish life and replaced it with the principle that we value truth above tradition, sincerity above conformity, and human needs above legal technicalities. But despite this step away from the dominance of halakha, liberal Judaism continued to teach a theology that argued that goodness, and this is really important, is elicited from us by our following a set of rules whose source is not us, but God. And of course, for modern liberal Jews, and Michael knows a lot about this, all of this becomes tied up in Kantian notions of the categorical imperative, which is problematic. And at some point, again, the role of neo-Kantian ethics in Jewish life probably needs addressing by us, but not now and not today, not now. But the key teaching in ethical monotheism is that what makes our foundational ethical values objective, non-arbitrary, non-negotiable, and therefore universal, is that they are values derived independently of the human mind and of the human context. In other words, they originate in or from God. So in the end, what we've said is that without God, objective moral values cannot and do not exist. That's the logical sequence of thinking, which is a problem for us, as you can imagine, because now that we live in a secular society where God's existence is at best a kind of side issue, what we're seeing is a movement towards and a development of subjective, personally based virtues, as opposed to the defending of the objective ethical values that we believed are derived from God. So we now elevate the adoption or cultivation of personal virtues, where feelings and specific life contexts are taken into consideration and are seen as a more appropriate way of determining what should actually be valued in our Jewish lives and how we should behave in any given situation. So I think this is completely understandable, this shift from the objective to the subjective. And liberal Jews, and perhaps particularly women, have rightly argued that there never have been objective ethical values, that objectivity was simply a way of lending credence to the subjective values of a dominant group, like white middle-class men, who then, these white middle-class men, then go on to say that the ethical values that they teach or enforce are somehow miraculously free of subjective interest, their interest, and that their objective values are based in reason, derived from observation, and even, oh my goodness me, from God's revelation. So there's a really nice link there between, men and God. Now, of course, the objectivized and universalized ethics of the ruling group conveniently set standards that maintain their hold on power and vested interest. So objectivity then is a convenient argument, some might say, me maybe, for enforcing a group's own particular or subjective standards on everyone else. And what we should be arguing is that objective universal ethics and values actually don't exist. There's only the subjective, the relative, the contextual, even the emotive, which is fine up to a point. Because the consequence of this thinking is that the objective universal ethics that are derived from ethical monotheism for us, so whether they are actually religious or secular, have now largely lost credibility. Well, that is up until now. Because today, what we're seeing is a resurgence of interest in objective ethical values. And the reason for this could be seen as part of our culture's yearning to get beyond some of the problematic consequences of living in a post-objective, and we know the expression, post-truth world, with its somewhat chaotic emphasis on the subjective and the emotive, where it seems as though feelings have taken priority in how we negotiate our social, political, as well as our private lives, which is a kind of unstable, if understandable, perspective. But what many people are witnessing now is how behaviours and opinions constructed on feelings are damaging the coherence of society. And most importantly, for me, it's disadvantaging the most vulnerable. Because if you think about it, justice is it's very difficult to base justice on the vagaries of feelings. So what I think we need, and this is just me, so you can come back, that's absolutely great. What I think we need is a new progressive, not reactionary take on objective ethical values, which is why contributions from a wide range of progressive thinkers like liberal Jews, humanists, secularists, feminists, even socialists are now being sought so that progressive, objective ethical values can make some kind of comeback. And if this is right, then a reconfigured narrative of ethical monotheism might just come in handy too, which is what I like to think, which for us has the added benefit of reviving a fundamental part of our identity as liberal Jews and puts what we have historically valued back into the mix, back into the struggle to make a better world. So let's think about how this might work. How might ethical monotheism work today? Well, again, it's kind of complicated and it's sort of pretty obvious. So among many progressive Jews, the idea that our lives are dictated to by God is a difficult one for many reasons, not the least of which is that for very many of us, God does not exist, at least not as some kind of ethical commander-in-chief. So what should we do? Well, we could abandon ethical monotheism in its classical guise, or We could bring everything that we've learned recently from critical approaches to theology, our theology, that come through feminist, humanist, Marxist, postmodern critiques, and rebuild ethical monotheism from a different but not unheard of perspective, which involves negotiating some sort of dynamic relationship between monotheism and humanism. And I would like to extend that to feminism if I get the chance. Again, we do this by constructing a theology that teaches that we, humanity, and not God, even if God exists, are the source of objective, universal ethical values. But crucially, and this is where a particular Jewish twist in my argument comes in, and it's this, that this is what God wants, which I'm going to very, very briefly explain. This move that I'm trying to encourage us to think about entails constructing a theology of ethical humanism, a theology of ethical humanism, which I think is a reasonably logical progression from the progressive teaching of ethical monotheism. And of course, it can already be found. It's wonderful. It's already there in a lot of our rabbinic interpretations of Torah. So we don't have to do an awful lot of new thinking. We just have to be kind of like clever and retrieve stuff. So with this in mind, we can justifiably explore and build on the notion that the direction of flow of Torah and its ethical teaching has shifted from the heavens. Just think back to that teaching in Bereshit, in Genesis, that Torah is no longer in the heavens, to it being propelled by the earthbound, interpretive and generative ethical genius of humanity, and specifically for us, the ethical genius of liberal Jews, which I think is a real thing. And so, in order that a liberal Jewish theology of ethical humanism meets all of our community's needs and views, I wonder whether it could be understood on a continuum. One end of which meets the demands of liberal Jewish humanists, atheists, agnostics, through to the beliefs of the more religious amongst us who maintain that God is still some sort of requirement when we think of our ethical values. But either way, the central teaching of a liberal Jewish ethical humanism is that this is our and God's common purpose, that humanity constructs a set of objective ethical values or ethical norms freely, without interference from the divine. I really hope I'm not going to get in trouble for saying this. The most important characteristic of this evolving but newish take on ethical monotheism then might be that God unbinds us from what we think are the dictates of a divinely originating ethical values, and that the covenant is not a binding covenant, but an unbinding covenant. And that this covenant of unbinding not only enables us to be good on our terms, but also makes God good, because God recognizes that our freedom from God is a prerequisite for our ethical behavior. So a theology of ethical humanism then understands the one God as good, because this God works continually towards unbinding, not binding covenants that are morally problematic because of, the kind of power thing that goes on between God and us. So a central teaching of a liberal Jewish theology of ethical humanism then is that God knows that we, humanity, have the capacity to construct objective ethical values and wants us, humans, to do so that we can be, as Martin Buber stated, the best possible versions of ourselves. And crucially, that this has to be of our own making. Now, oh my goodness, there's a lot more to say, but we've run out of time. I've probably well gone over time. And I think this is a really, really good moment to segue into Michael's contribution to tonight's session. because he's going to probably make way more sense of what I've just said. So, Michael, can I hand over to you?
Thank you, thank you, Judith. Wow, that was really a tour de force. I think we all need just to take a moment to reflect on those very wise and thoughtful words. It's really important that this work is being done, and Judith is definitely leading us in this area, and that liberal Judaism can be a real vanguard for rethinking this idea. I'm so grateful and appreciative of the time I've had with Judith to think about these things, and with some of our other colleagues who are on tonight, as well as our lay leaders as well in our congregations, who in many ways epitomize this new idea just by the leadership they show in the congregations and the work that's happening in liberal Judaism. What I want to do, and I'll be briefer than Judith, just so that we do have some time to discuss, is to give us a language, a framework within which perhaps these ideas can be discussed and talked about. And I want to introduce us to the concept of virtue ethics, which is a new field of study in the work of ethics that a philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, introduced. And virtue ethics suggests, as Judith has expressed, that there are humanistic-based virtues, part of our character, if you like, that we need to cultivate in order to understand how to create the kind of ethical system that Judith is calling for. So we might start with Alistair MacIntyre and talk about the definition of virtue ethics, but I'm actually going to start with Maimonides, because as kind of Judith intimated, we haven't necessarily always understood objective in the same way, meaning that there have been strands in our tradition where we all thought that we were following, let's say, one halakha, when in fact we know, certainly as progressive Jews, that there was never that kind of uniformity of either thinking or action in Judaism. That Judaism has long had invisible strains, invisible threads running through our long history that are just really being uncovered again and again in each generation. So let's just go to Maimonides here. I'll read it out for sake of time. All that is contained in the law, and he gives some examples: the giving of tithes, the gleaning of the harvest, the leaving of the corners of the field for the poor, the law of the sabbatical year, the giving of charity according to the needs of others. All these are practiced in order that we may depart from the dispositions of meanness and neglect of others, but rather that they may become instilled in us a quality of generosity and care. Now, this might be very surprising for some people to learn that the laws that we all thought were given and therefore have to be obeyed, and our commands that are beyond our reasoning, actually, in Maimonides' terms, also have a part to play in the dispositions of our character. That is, we are beginning to see here a sense that these mitzvot are a means to an end. This is something that Rabbi John Rayner often taught, that we need to understand that these aspects of our practical lives are considered to be just the ways in which we can develop a sense of what Judith is calling ethical humanism. So this quality of generosity and care is the purpose, the underlying assumptions of why we might do those things that Maimonides enumerates in the beginning of this paragraph. But Maimonides goes a stage further, which is even more radical and provocative. If you should test most of the commandments from this point of view, you would find they are all for the discipline and guidance of the faculties of the soul. Perhaps the word soul here is a word that we could interpret as character or ethical humanism. If a person will always carefully discriminate as regard their actions, a person will reach the highest degree of perfection possible to a human being and therefore approach the essence of God. Again, the relationship between the human and the divine is then, in a sense, reversed. By doing these things, by understanding that we could reach a higher perfection in our character, we then become a reflection of what God wants us to be. Now, these ideas, and I forgot to turn this into a slideshow, so let me do that. There we go. That means I can change the slide now. These ideas, these virtues, we might identify in individual components. The individual components of these virtues can be called midot. And in our tradition, we have, from the very earliest of our literature, perhaps even back to Proverbs, we have the ideas of these cultivation of dispositions that are part of the human character. And these midot, these qualities of life, are the ones that we should be nurturing and forming and cultivating in ourselves in order to become that sense of human aspiration. When we put the midot together, we create a form of character development, Jewish character development, which has become well known, certainly in North American Reform and liberal Jewish circles, as the Musar movement. Now, Musar, of which we could do a whole nother lecture, is to my mind a hidden thread in the long history of Jewish literature and thought. And it has not been as prominent as, say, halakha, Jewish law, but I believe it is as important as halakha. It is the long thread of thought that runs from the book of Proverbs all the way through the understanding behind the rabbinic literature that indicates how we can become better people, through the medieval commentaries, particularly when we come to last week and the week before, we had the whole story of Abraham being hospitable to the three angels who come to his and Sarah's tent. That whole notion in the medieval commentaries of Abraham being an exemplar of hospitality comes to us within that thread of character development. And it leads on into the work of Bachya ibn Pakuda in the Middle Ages, who wrote a book called Duties of the Heart, believing that what he called the duties of the limbs, that is our the ways we use our feet and our hands and our bodies and our mouths to do Jewish things, is not as important as what he called the duties of the heart, that is the ethical stances we take and the ways we cultivate those character developments. So the Musar movement then moves and morphs into the early modern period with the work of Rabbi Salanter, and indeed has its influences from outside of Judaism, from Western culture, particularly from the work of Benjamin Franklin, which surprisingly enough influenced the Musar movement, and then on to the modern and postmodern work that's being done by various rabbis in Jerusalem, in North America, and in Europe. So we have a Musar movement that has been hidden from us for a very long time. And in essence, it requires us and recalls us to the best of what we can be. And in many ways, liberal Judaism could and should be highlighting Musar as the crux of what we now consider to be the source and the authority for being and doing the things that we do in Judaism. I think it would probably be true to say that the work that Lily Montague was doing at the turn of the 20th century, with her inherent understanding of caring for others and for being a partner in the work of tikkun, of making the world a better place, That was an instinct that she felt very, very deeply. And in many ways, had she known about Musar and Midot, the characteristics of Musar, she would have been very much in sympathy with it. Certainly, as growing up, as I did, as a liberal Jew in Birmingham and then in London, Musar was not a word that I heard very much until I came to the United States, where it has now become quite a predominant feature of this idea of growing a new ethical disposition. So just to perhaps put that into a practical aspect of what we mean, if we take the midah, the quality of chesed, chesed is a word that appears in the Bible and, of course, in our Jewish literature throughout that long thread that I've just been through. It's one of the most fundamental of the midot, and it's difficult to translate because it doesn't have a one-word translation. Sometimes we use the word loving kindness to understand the idea of chesed. But some of the scholars who have studied its implications suggest that it has some more nuanced understandings. Chesed is a completely undeserved kindness and generosity. That means that it is something we don't do by command. We don't do because we are obligated, and we don't receive it because we feel that we deserve it, but rather it comes to us both as kindness and in acts of generosity. And so we can also say that chesed is love put to action, not just feelings, not just those things expressed, but things that are done to actually exemplify what chesed can do in the lives of ourselves and others. And it is wrapping up in itself all the positive attributes of God: love, covenant, faithfulness, mercy, grace, kindness, loyalty. We see loyalty particularly in the use of chesed in the book of Ruth, when Ruth and Naomi begin a relationship of chesed. In short, acts of devotion and loving kindness, though, go beyond the requirement of duty. It's a really fundamental component of the characteristics of a midah. One of the most prominent philosophers in North America, Nell Noddings, who has written a book on the ethics of care, suggests that this notion of quality of kindness and generosity can be expressed in the ideas that we have about caring in our modern society. Caring, in a sense, for Noddings, is the chesed that we talk about in our literature. So what is caring? Caring is basic in human life. All people need and want to be cared for. Men and women are guided by an ethic of care, which is a natural aspect of our humanity. It's a form of caring that does not require an ethical effort to motivate us. We don't need a source of God or divinity or a halakha, Jewish law, to motivate us to want to be those who provide care. And care can mean care for our families. Care can mean care for the vulnerable in society. Care can mean those who are ones who receive our care and are cared for in our lives, the elderly, the children, those who have physical or mental health needs. Now, Nell Noddings, as Judith also suggests, comes out of the school of feminism and feminist thought that has been able to help us, all of us, men and women alike, and all genders, to have an understanding of caring as a part of our human endeavor. But it does have, obviously, a significant basis in women's experience. But she has suggested that natural caring is a moral attitude, a longing for goodness that arises out of the experience or memory of being cared for. So those who are being cared for have just an important place in the understanding of caring as those who provide the caring itself. So this notion of ethical caring is a state of being in relationship. It is the most important relationship, the relationship in which we will come with other people to begin to understand the empathy, the compassion, the relationship of nurturing that has to be characterized, as she says, by receptivity, relatedness, and engrossment. This is our ideal. It is to understand that this midah of chesed can be expressed through the importance that we will provide and give to the relationship of caring in the lives of the people, the ones that we are both connected to and the ones that we are not yet connected to, but to whom we should be connected. And finally, how do you do this? How do you cultivate this disposition of a midah, of a chesed, or a caring? MacIntyre, who originated this framework, suggests there are 4 aspects, and these 4 are ones that we should keep in mind. First of all, there is modeling, the idea that there are those to whom we look to show us how to do this. And you may look around your communities and think of those who really model an aspect of caring. It seems to come naturally to them. They seem to have a natural affinity for always being the first to reach out, to support the elderly, to support the homeless, to support in severe need. And they are not wary or cautious about providing that care. They model it for many of us, and we look to them often to see how we can follow in their wake. But it also requires what is called practice, and this is a very important part of MacIntyre's model, that unless we do this on a frequent basis, we are being sporadic about our disposition to make this part of who we are. Practice is a frequent, continuous, and important aspect of our own selves. Practice is something we do when we are committed and dedicated to the purpose of it. Practice is got to be cultivated, and it has to be developed, something maybe over a lifetime that we are always continuing to do, how to show our care is deepening, is widening, is being more expansive, how to understand that we as human beings, and particularly we as liberal Jews, should be involved in this work of trying to understand how to make our practice of chesed something that is part of ourselves. Of course, one of the issues here, and we may come back to it in our discussion, is how does practice work? Is it better when practice is, in a sense, commanded, when we are told to do something regularly and we are, in a sense, enforced to do it regularly? Or does practice come from when we voluntarily choose to take it upon ourselves to make sure that these actions are continuous? The third aspect of virtue ethics, of the work of virtue ethics, is dialogue. That is the conversations, the opportunity to begin to talk about these aspects of our character in our communities. And this is something that I would recommend that all of us in our liberal Jewish communities have an opportunity to discuss and talk about this work that is so important. And then finally, for this work to be affirmed by our leaders, our rabbis, our community leaders, so that we can confirm that this is the work of liberal Judaism and that this is something we should all endeavor to work towards. So some of the questions you might be thinking about before we have a little bit of time to discuss, I want you to think about, how is chesed expressed in the lives of people you know? How can it be nurtured and developed? Where is chesed talked about amongst both the carers and the cared for? And who affirms chesed as ethic in your community leadership? And hopefully we've given you some vocabulary and some thinking about the nature of what this new type of ethical humanism might actually mean for us as liberal Jews. So I'm going to turn back to Judith, and then hopefully we'll have some time for you as well.
There we go. Thank you, Michael. That was amazing. I think that I was going to say something about how Michael has started a train of thinking for myself, but I don't want to talk anymore because it would be really good if we just have a few minutes to break out into some small groups so that you all get a chance to express anything that any thoughts that have occurred to you this evening. And you don't have to use these ideas or questions as guidance, but you should have on your screen now 4 questions. And it's to do with the scenario that I discussed at the beginning of the evening, which is whether you think that tzedakah is like an objective value, as Michael was saying, and as I was saying, it's a sort of it's a rule, and you don't really have to think. You don't have to think about it, you just do it. Or does it come from virtue that we have to cultivate? Is tzedakah a command then, or a choice? Is it a universal value or a particular choice? Is tzedakah, does it come through command? Is it more effective if it comes through command than if it comes through choice? Does it change society if it's based in command? Or does it change society? Do we have to be the change, in a sense, that we want to see in society, which means that we would be giving through choice? So those are some of the questions. Tom, I don't know whether you can just break us into small groups for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes.
Yeah, I think Tom is ready to do that.
Hello, it's Louise, my wife.
Back to the main session.
Hi.
Hi. Is it?
I think the breakout room's finished.
Is it?
Now we're back.
Okay.
Yeah, no, we're all back together again now.
I was just asking Stephen a question. I thought he wanted to respond.
I was thinking when you were talking about is charity a mitzvah, I was thinking of the Yom Kippur liturgy. I don't know where it comes from or why it's in there. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's just from the Middle Ages or something. I'm not very old, but
old enough.
Yes. Yeah, about charity prayer and penitence, averting the decree and all that kind of stuff.
Right. Exactly. Thank you.
Wow. I don't know. I have no idea what the time is. I suspect we're getting very close to
You've
8:30.
got 3 minutes before 8:30.
Oh my goodness. Well, my breakout group was great, and I learned something, and I just want to say thank you to the people that have shared tonight's discussion. I wish that I'd been in all of your breakout groups to hear what you had to say. Maybe we could pick up this the thinking of this session, some other LJ venue. I think it would be very, very, very interesting. This thinking is moving on all the time, as Michael really powerfully illustrated, and I was fortunate enough to have Rabbi Eli Tikvasera in my group, who also threw a lot of very interesting light on this subject. So I think as soon as we can all get together again to explore this fully and to see how we can perhaps redirect some of the teachings around ethical monotheism for our communities today, it would be a really wonderful endeavor. I don't know, Michael, would you? Michael, I feel like I should give you the last word.
Oh, I don't know about the last word, but I so appreciated this conversation, and I do think it would be wonderful to carry it forward. I think it could take a lovely day's conference. Hate to put the burden on Aaron and Leah, but yeah, I'd love to see this as part of. We used to have these wonderful day conferences at the Montague Center. Do you remember those? And it would be great to really spend a day or even two on just some of the themes and hear from people like Eli Tikvasera and others who are so important in this conversation. Yeah, I would really encourage everyone to try and look up Musar and to understand how Musar and liberal Judaism could find a conversation together. And let's see if we can start thinking about some of our own literature from the past as being works that will enable us to move forward in thinking about the ideas that Judith has so aptly put to us today.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, and also no. Oh, sorry, I've got to stop. I just keep talking. I'm gonna stop and let you all relax this evening.
So I would really like to thank you both on behalf of all of us here. It is no coincidence that there are many of us rabbis that wanted to come tonight to be part of this conversation with you, Judith, and you, Michael, and really good for so many of us to see Rabbi Eli Tikvasera here, for whose compelling commitments many of us use to teach on around our attitudes to God and that sense of compulsion versus commandment. So a really great just to think of how we've built on the shoulders of the past. I really hope that we will have an opportunity to continue this. It felt almost cruel to only have a taste from both of you. We have our biennial to look forward to, but maybe we need to have something even before the biennial to continue. There is great appetite within our liberal community to have this conversation, and Michael and Judith, you really gave us so much to think about. So I'm really grateful to you both, and I know I speak for all of us here. A reminder, next week is Rabbi Alexandra Wright on the influence of the prophets on liberal Judaism, which should be another excellent session. So with thanks to Rabbi Aaron Goldstein, who's put this term, this semester of sessions together. Really, we have much to be proud of within our tradition and our movement. Is there anything else that I need to remind Tom or no? All good. So thank you so much, everyone, and look forward to next week's.